Welcome to Thinking Deeper by 6-7. Imagine the ultimate intellectual debate between absolute divine authority and the universe's first rebel. Today, we are examining John Milton's epic Paradise Regained, but we're looking at it through a very specific lens. We're going to evaluate the very nature of God, exploring how the devil's arguments against Jesus closely mirror modern skepticism, materialist philosophies, and atheistic critiques of divine authority. We'll unpack the psychology of temptation and why the ultimate evil doesn't sound like a monster, but rather a hyperlogical skeptic. Before we jump into the wilderness, if you like my channel, please subscribe and hit the like button. It really helps us bring you more of these explorations.
I am so glad we are digging into this today. To set the scope for you, the source material we are working with is this incredibly detailed, really analytical breakdown of Milton's 17th century text.
Right, which is technically a sequel to Paradise Lost.
Exactly. It's a sequel based on the temptation narrative in the Gospel of Luke. But our mission here on this deep dive is not just to, dryly recount the plot of a really old poem.
No, that would be incredibly boring.
Right. We are diving into the structural mechanics of the theological and philosophical evaluations of God presented in this work.
Okay, I love that.
We want to dissect how Satan basically operates as a modern empiricist, demanding observable proof, how he rigorously questions the morality of God's design, and how the text defends the underlying logic of a divine nature.
Okay, let's unpack this, because before we can truly analyze the sophisticated arguments being launched against God, we have to establish the exact parameters of the God being challenged here.
That is a crucial starting point.
Right, because back in the 1600s, when Milton was actually writing this, the historical and theological debate over the exact mechanics of Jesus' divinity was incredibly intense.
Oh, absolutely. It was a massive point of contention.
The crux of the argument was whether he was fully God, meaning he retained total omniscience, absolute power, and was essentially just wearing a biological human suit.
A biological human suit, right.
Yeah, exactly. Or if he was fully man. And as a reader, you have to look at the premise and question the fundamental logic of tempting an all-powerful being.
It almost seems like a paradox, doesn't it?
It really does. Think about it through the lens of a video game. If you load into a game on God mode with infinite health, infinite stamina, and, full visibility of the entire map.
The obstacles just don't matter.
Exactly. They simply do not matter. Temptation is functionally meaningless if you already know the outcome of the maze and are completely incapable of taking any actual damage.
Yeah, the stakes would absolutely vanish. I mean, if the protagonist is entirely invulnerable, the 40 days of starvation in the desert is reduced to pure cosmic theater.
Right, it's just a performance.
Exactly. But what's fascinating here is how Milton constructs a theological framework to navigate that exact paradox.
Okay, how does he do that?
Well, the Jesus portrayed in Paradise Regained is written as possessing a perfect divine mind and perfect underlying wisdom. But crucially, that perfection is strictly confined within the harsh limitations of human biology. Ah, okay. So the biology is real.
Very real. The text makes it absolutely clear that he is not hovering an inch above the dirt to avoid the friction of reality. He is embedded in it.
Wow.
Yeah, he experiences agonizing cellular hunger. He feels the neurological reality of fear, the biting cold of the desert night, and profound psychological sorrow.
So he's truly feeling all of it.
He is. The underlying divine alignment is present, but the physical and emotional suffering is utterly authentic.
Okay, let me push back on that framework for a second, though.
Sure, go ahead.
Even if we accept that the physical hunger is real, if he still retains a perfect divine mind, doesn't that inherently give him an unfair advantage over the human condition?
That's a really fair question.
How can his suffering be considered 100% authentic if his mind is perfectly divine and presumably shielded from the kind of existential despair that breaks normal people?
Right, and that is the exact friction the poem addresses. It really comes down to the philosophical necessity of incarnation.
Meaning what exactly? Well, having a perfect divine mind doesn't mean being shielded from despair. In Milton's framework, it means having the ultimate capacity to comprehend the sheer weight of that despair without being corrupted by it.
Oh, interesting. So he feels it, but it doesn't break his moral compass.
Precisely. And the reasoning here is foundational to the concept of salvation. For a divine being to hold any legitimate moral authority over humanity, or to eventually serve as a meaningful sacrifice, they must genuinely endure the grueling limitations of the human condition without hitting an escape hatch.
They can't just pause the game and walk away.
Exactly. A sovereign deity who remains entirely exempt from the suffering of its creation, a god who has never tasted biological exhaustion or the terror of mortality, lacks the experiential authority to judge or save that creation.
That makes a lot of sense. You cannot justly rule a broken world if you have completely insulated yourself from its brokenness.
That's beautifully put, and that reframes the entire setup.
It really does. The God mode cheat is genuinely deactivated. And because Jesus is completely vulnerable in this state, wandering the desert, starving and exposed, Satan identifies a tactical opening.
He sees his chance.
He does. But because of the intellectual nature of his opponent, Satan doesn't launch a physical assault with cosmic fire or legions of fallen angels.
Right, that wouldn't work at all.
No. He attacks the very concept of divine authority, the way a hostile corporate takeover happens. He uses a subtle, relentless litigation of the rules, relying heavily on rationalism, skepticism, and philosophical critique.
Because brute force is a weapon for the physical realm, and Satan recognizes immediately that he is engaged in a psychological and spiritual war.
So how does he actually start this war?
Well, he begins with a reconnaissance tactic. He approaches the starting Jesus disguised as a harmless, impoverished old man gathering firewood.
Oh, wow, just an old man in the desert.
Yeah, and he casually points out their mutual starvation and suggests a very pragmatic solution. He said, okay, if you are the Son of God, simply alter the molecular structure of these stones and turn them into bread.
It sounds so reasonable on the surface.
It does. But Jesus instantly deconstructs the disguise by quoting scripture, asserting that human survival is not merely biological but spiritual. And when that happens, Satan just abandons the theatrical disguise completely.
And here's where it gets really interesting, because once the cover is blown, Satan executes this masterful public relations pivot.
Oh, his PR spin is incredible.
It is. He doesn't retreat or apologize. He stops playing the rural peasant and immediately casts himself as a misunderstood philanthropist.
Right, the victim of bad press.
Exactly. He claims that he, the devil, is actually the unsung co-partner of the world, aiding humanity by providing signs, oracles, and dreams to guide them through the darkness.
It is an audacious repositioning. I mean, he frames his rebellion not as evil, but as a necessary alternative service.
A public service, basically.
Yeah. He is essentially arguing to Jesus that humanity relies on him for practical guidance, and that he delivers measurable results when the heavens remain silent.
Which leads directly into his first massive critique of God's motives. And honestly, this is a critique that echoes almost verbatim the modern anti-theistic arguments you hear today.
Oh, absolutely. It's shockingly modern.
He paints God as a cosmic egomaniac. Satan lays out this deeply rational, highly skeptical argument, suggesting that God engineered the entire universe, including sentient humanity, for the sole narcissistic purpose of demanding perpetual worship.
He's projecting his own flaws onto the divine.
Yes. He whispers to Jesus, questioning why any rational being should subjugate themselves to a divine dictator whose primary administrative goal seems to be an endless ego boost.
And you can see what he's doing. Satan is actively trying to sever Jesus' trust in the fundamental goodness of the Father by applying a cynical human psychological defect, which is narcissism, to the divine nature.
Right, but Jesus doesn't buy it.
Not at all. Jesus' counter-argument completely dismantles the premise by addressing the ontological difference between a creator and a creation.
How does he break that down?
Jesus argues that God did not spark the universe into existence to fill a void or to seek external validation. God, by definition, is entirely complete within himself.
Okay, so
He didn't need us. Exactly. Existence itself is an unearned, profound gift, and the universe was created as an overflow of inherent goodness. And as for the demand for glory, Jesus redefines the concept entirely.
How so?
He explains that glory is not the forced applause demanded by a dictator. Glory is simply the logical, natural recompense of gratitude.
Oh, okay.
When a creator freely gives the ultimate gifts of life, consciousness, and agency, a creation returning thanks is not feeding an ego. It is simply the correct rational alignment with reality.
Wow, that completely shifts the definition of worship. It's the difference between a tyrant demanding a parade and a drowning person naturally thanking the lifeguard who pulled them from the water.
That's a perfect analogy.
Right. Refusing to say thank you in that scenario isn't a bold stance for independence. It's a denial of the reality of the rescue.
Exactly.
And Jesus takes it a step further by exposing the glaring hypocrisy at the very core of Satan's misunderstood philanthropist rebrand.
Oh, he completely calls him out.
He does. Satan claims he is this great benefactor, handing out prophecies and knowledge to ease human suffering. But Jesus sharply reminds him of the chronological reality. The world was perfectly ordered before Satan introduced the virus of rebellion.
The text really highlights this ultimate gaslighting operation.
Yes,
I mean, Satan introduced the systemic suffering, the mortality, and the chaotic separation from the divine in the first place. Therefore, any help he offers the ensuing generations is purely transactional and deeply predatory.
it functions exactly like a cosmic protection racket.
Oh, totally.
He breaks humanity's legs, hands them a cheap wooden crutch, and then demands they bow down to him in gratitude for the mobility assistance.
That is exactly what it is.
He is exploiting the exact misery he manufactured in order to build his own geopolitical kingdom. And because Jesus possesses that perfect underlying divine wisdom, he sees right through the PR spin.
The philosophical debate completely stalls out for Satan at this point.
It really does. So what does he do next?
Well, the failure of the abstract theological argument forces Satan to pivot to the second major theater of the debate, which is systemic earthly suffering.
Okay.
This brings us to the temptation of secular humanism. Satan realizes that debating the metaphysics of glory just isn't working, so he drops the spiritual arguments and leans heavily into raw materialism.
He makes it about the here and now.
Yes. He essentially challenges Jesus by saying, forget the architecture of heaven for a moment. Look at the agonizing physical reality of the earth right now. And he elevates Jesus to a vantage point where he reveals all the mighty, sprawling empires of the globe.
The big players of the ancient world.
Exactly. The military might of Parthia, the philosophical centers of Greece, and the absolute dominance of Rome.
And he specifically singles out the Roman emperor, Tiberius, framing him accurately as a brutish, corrupt, and cruel monster who is actively oppressing millions of people.
And this is perhaps the most insidious trap in the entire narrative because it mirrors the modern dilemma of how to handle systemic injustice.
It's so relevant.
It really is. Satan lays out an argument for a forced utopia. He tempts Jesus with immense wealth, diplomatic leverage, and absolute military supremacy.
Giving him the tools to fix things.
Right. The argument is intoxicatingly pragmatic. He says, if you are truly the benevolent Son of God, you cannot simply watch this suffering continue. Take the throne today.
Fix it right now.
Exactly. He tells him, you have the raw power to overthrow this tyrant, institute perfect laws, and force global peace. Why wait on some mysterious, protracted divine timeline when you can eradicate poverty and oppression by noon?
That is such a heavy temptation. And I actually love the humorous detail from the source material about this, the behind-the-scenes glimpse into the psychology of this tactic before it happened.
Oh, the council scene.
Yeah. Milton includes a scene where Satan consults his council of fallen angels to strategize. And the demon Belial suggests they tempt Jesus with women, citing that lust successfully compromised King Solomon, who was supposedly the wisest man alive.
It's such a basic, unimaginative strategy.
Exactly. And Satan instantly shuts that idea down with striking clarity.
Yeah, the dismissal of Belial is a vital key to understanding the sophistication of the temptation. Satan admonishes his subordinate, explaining that Belial weighs everyone on his own flawed scales.
Right.
Belial is consumed by base carnal desires, so he assumes all beings are driven by them. Satan understands that a being of pure intellect and profound righteousness will never be derailed by something as pedestrian as lust or gluttony.
So how do you trap someone like that?
Well, to trap a truly good being, you must weaponize their goodness. You must tempt them with intellectual pride and the illusion of immediate practical impact.
So what does this all mean for the mechanics of the temptation? It reveals that Satan is not asking Jesus to commit an overtly evil act.
Right, he's not telling him to do something horrific.
No. He isn't suggesting Jesus slaughter innocents or burn a city. He is asking Jesus to do the right thing, like dethrone a tyrant, establish justice, feed the global population, but to do it in the wrong way.
Exactly. The methodology is the trap.
The trap is convincing Jesus to rely entirely on his own earthly agency, to utilize the blunt instrument of military force, and to completely bypass the agonizing patience required by God's divine timing.
Because the trap is the total eradication of human free will.
Right. The forced utopia.
That is the dark underbelly of the materialist temptation. If Jesus accepts the Roman throne and governs the globe with an iron fist, Even if that fist is perfectly benevolent, he fundamentally negates humanity's capacity to choose.
Because a forced utopia is still a cage.
Exactly. If he imposes morality through legislative violence and military supremacy, he becomes the exact dictatorial tyrant that Satan previously accused God of being.
Oh, wow. That's a brilliant point.
Yeah, Satan is offering the crown of global rulership, but aggressively removing the necessary suffering of the cross.
The shortcut to the finish line ruins the integrity of the race. And Jesus rejects the pragmatism entirely.
He doesn't take the bait.
Not for a second. He counters that true dominion is not found in the subjugation of nations, but in the total mastery of one's own spirit.
Which is a profound shift in values.
Absolutely. He reminds Satan that God placed higher value on Job, a man who lost everything and possessed no earthly kingdom but maintained his integrity, than on the vast sprawling empires of conquerors.
And it is this specific, unyielding rejection of earthly metrics that finally shatters Satan's composure.
He just completely loses it.
We witnessed a profound psychological unraveling. Up to this moment, Satan has maintained the persona of a suave, detached, hyperlogical debater.
The cool skeptic.
Right. But the realization that immense wealth, absolute power, imperial glory, and immediate political impact hold absolutely zero value to Jesus causes a catastrophic error in Satan's operating system.
It does not compute.
It doesn't, because those earthly metrics are the exact currencies that drove Satan to orchestrate his own rebellion.
So Satan experiences a complete collapse of identity. He admits that he's been tracking Jesus since the birth in Bethlehem, observing his development, analyzing his every decision, and he is entirely baffled by the data.
He just can't figure him out.
Exactly. The facade drops, and Satan actually cries out to Jesus in the text, declaring, "I am or was a son of God too."
It's so sad.
It really is. It's a jarringly raw, desperate admission of inadequacy.
The literary tragedy of the moment is palpable. I mean, Satan is staring at the genuinely beloved son, frantically trying to quantify the variables that make Jesus worthy of the title, while realizing his own vast cosmic resume means absolutely nothing.
The dynamic perfectly mirrors a displaced older sibling who operates entirely on a transactional worldview.
Oh, I love that analogy.
Think about it. Picture an older brother who is singularly obsessed with building his resume, accumulating wealth, and achieving status because he deeply believes that love and validation must be purchased through power.
Right, it's all transactional.
Yes. Then he looks at his younger sibling, who achieves nothing on paper but simply embodies pure grace and receives unconditional love. The older sibling's worldview simply cannot process that reality.
It breaks his brain.
It does. Satan is waving his resume of celestial rebellion and earthly dominance, screaming into the void, "Why is he the chosen one? What empirical value does he possess that I lack?"
And that consuming desperation to quantify the divine drives Satan to his final, most aggressive tactic.
The last resort.
Yes. Having failed to win the philosophical debate and having his materialist bribes categorically rejected, Satan demands empirical, undeniable proof.
He wants hard data.
Exactly. The intellectual warfare shifts to a demand for hard data. He physically transports Jesus away from the desert, taking him to the sprawling city of Jerusalem, and places him precariously on the highest pinnacle of the great temple.
Literally balancing on the absolute edge of a fatal drop.
Precisely. And this raises an important question about the modern tension between the necessity of faith and the demand for measurable data.
How so?
Well, Satan issues the ultimate skeptical challenge, weaponizing scripture in a final attempt to force a reaction. He tells Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, cast yourself down, for it is written that the angels will bear you up."
Wow. It's the ultimate demand for a reproducible experiment.
It really is.
Satan is essentially saying, stop speaking in parables and prove it to me right now. Jump off the roof, let's observe the data, and let's physically see the angels catch you.
And it is the defining trap for the hyper-rational mind. It's the demand that spiritual realities submit to empirical validation to satisfy a skeptic's ego.
Because Satan thinks he has him cornered.
He does. Satan operates on the assumption that if Jesus truly possesses infinite divine power, his inherent pride will compel him to display it.
He assumes Jesus has an ego.
Right. Satan projects his own narcissism, knowing definitively that if he possessed that power, he would leap immediately just to bask in the spectacle of his own rescue.
Of course he would.
But Jesus does not engage with the premise. He refuses to flex his divine muscle for an audience of one. He simply counters with a final definitive boundary. He says, "Do not tempt the Lord thy God."
He categorically refuses to perform a supernatural parlor trick just to satisfy an adversary's demand for data.
Exactly.
He recognizes that participating in the experiment validates the skeptic's right to test the divine, which flips the hierarchy of authority entirely.
And the sheer lack of ego in that refusal is what ultimately destroys Satan's framework.
It's the final blow.
It is. The text describes that upon hearing that quiet, unyielding boundary, Satan physically and spiritually falls. He is entirely bested, plunging from the pinnacle in total defeat, while the text notes that angels finally descend to minister to Jesus.
Wow.
Yeah. The climax of the epic proves that true divine supremacy does not manifest in flashy displays of kinetic energy. It doesn't rely on forcing empirical evidence down the throat of a hardened skeptic.
So what does it rely on?
The ultimate power in the universe is revealed as total restraint, perfect obedience to a higher design, and an unshakable trust in the Father's timeline, regardless of the immediate suffering it requires.
The contrast is just staggering when you step back and look at the architecture of the narrative. This deep dive reveals that in Milton's theological vision, the ultimate battle for the fate of humanity is never depicted as a kinetic war with clashing swords, shattered shields, and cosmic explosions.
Not at all.
No, it is entirely a war of ideas. It is an excruciatingly precise evaluation of whether God's authority is inherently just and whether the methodologies of heaven can withstand the pragmatic critiques of the earth.
Which is why the text forces you, the listener, to rigorously audit your own definitions of power and progress.
That's a great point.
You have to ask yourself, does true power reside in the immediate accumulation of earthly influence, the rapid deployment of immense wealth, and the cynical modern demand that everything in the universe provide empirical proof of its value before it is trusted?
Or is it something else?
Right. Or is there a deeper, more resilient power found in spiritual endurance, the willingness to suffer for a principle, and an unwavering inner conviction that resists the shortcuts of the ego?
That is the core question.
Satan offers Jesus the total subjugation of the globe immediately, without a single casualty. But the hidden cost is the compromise of the soul and the erasure of free will. Jesus intentionally chooses the grueling, unglamorous, and deeply painful road of systemic obedience, understanding that true redemption cannot be forced by a dictator, it must be chosen by the redeemed.
It fundamentally redefines the concept of the epic hero. There are no sweeping armies charging across a battlefield in this story. The climax of human history is distilled down to two isolated figures having an intense philosophical conversation. First in a desolate, starving wilderness, and finally balancing on the edge of a temple roof.
It's so intimate.
Yes, yet the stakes resting on the nuances of that conversation are the survival of human agency, the validity of free will, and the very definition of what constitutes actual goodness.
Which leaves us with a critical, final thought for you to carry into your day.
Lay on us.
If the ultimate evil doesn't announce itself with cartoonish monstrosities and obvious repulsive horrors, but instead approaches us with perfectly reasonable-sounding, highly pragmatic arguments for self-reliance, immediate gratification, and the absolute demand for empirical proof before we grant our trust.
Well, actually, I shouldn't trail off. The question is, how do we successfully distinguish between our own practical rational wisdom and our egos secretly trying to play God?
That is a profoundly heavy question, and it brings us full circle to the paradox we started with. The ultimate intellectual debate isn't always fought in the grand arenas of history or the sweeping cosmos. More often than not, it is fought in the quiet, desolate wilderness of our own minds.
The greatest threats to our moral integrity might never be roaring monsters or obvious villains, but rather those hyperlogical, deeply pragmatic skeptics whispering that we could run our personal universe just a little bit better and a little bit faster, entirely on our own. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the narratives around you, keep exploring the deeper mechanics of your own decisions, and we will catch you next time.